Hello everyone, and today I am outside because the lighting and it's the only place I can get good lighting anymore because my basement lighting is garbage. But today we got a nice little chill video I just wanted to go through because I thought this stuff was pretty interesting. So, today we're going to be looking at every single royal line of succession of the English/British throne since 1066 all the way to 2022. Now, what I mean by line of succession is we're going to talk about the monarchs themselves all the way to through their heir apparent and even the second in line to the throne. So we're going to find out not only the monarchs themselves and when they reigned and why they're related to each other, why they took the throne, and also potential monarchs that missed out on becoming king or queen or whatever it was. So we're starting here with 1066. Now, the history of England goes back really far through the Anglo-Saxon monarchs, but we're not going to go. I just had to pick one place to start, and I decided to start with 1066 when William the Conqueror first took over England because it just seemed like a good place to start, and 1,000 years of history is plenty to give you guys a lot of information. So for those of you that don't even know anything much about the English monarchs, this could get you some information. So we're starting with 1066. So for those of you that don't know, in 1066, that was the year that the Normans from France and the Duke of Normandy, William, the Duke of Normandy, they was known at that time as William the Bastard because he had been banished from France for a little bit, and then he came back and became the Duke of Normandy. And so he decided to lead an expedition up to England to conquer it, basically take it over. Because the previous king at the start of 1066 was a man named Edward the Confessor. He was king. He had been on the throne since about 1042 when the Anglo-Saxons took back England from the Vikings or the Danes, whatever you want to call them, the kings of Denmark at the time, specifically Harold Harefoot. So Edward the Confessor took them back over in 1042. He promised William the Conqueror. Edward the Confessor didn't have any kids. He didn't have any sons, so he had to choose an heir. So he basically sent a letter to William when he was the Duke of Normandy. I keep getting snaps over here. He sent a letter to William, who was the Duke of Normandy. He said, "You know what, William? Since I don't have any sons, when I die, you get to take the throne of England." And William's like, "Oh yeah, heck yeah, I'll do that." But things go wrong. On the 5th of January, 1066, when Edward the Confessor is on his deathbed, his brother-in-law, Harold Godwinson, is in the room with him, and supposedly Edward the Confessor pointed to Harold Godwinson, and that was interpreted that he was going to take after Edward the Confessor, take the throne. And Harold had not always gotten along so well with Edward the Confessor. In fact, they really didn't do much together, to be honest. I don't know why they chose him. It was probably just a scheme made up by Harold Godwinson to take the throne. But after William the Conqueror heard about Edward's death, he got really mad and decided that in September of that year, he was going to build up an army of Normans and go over and basically kill Harold Godwinson, defeat his armies, and conquer England. And he did that in 1066 at the Battle of Hastings in September of 1066. Kills Harold Godwinson, becomes king. So that's when the Anglo-Saxon England officially ends, and it becomes French with the Normans. Now, William the Conqueror now holds two titles. You're gonna have to keep this in mind for once we get. Sorry, I'm talking so much, so I'm just laying out some groundwork for what's happening right now. So he holds two major titles. This is very important. He is the Duke of Normandy, which is very important. It's what he had previously been, and he conquers England. So he's the King of England and the Duke of Normandy. William the Conqueror, if you ever heard of William the First, same guy. William the First and William the Conqueror. I call him William the Conqueror because, it's just a much cooler name than William the First. So he's got his main heir to the throne right now is his eldest son named Robert. Robert was born in 1054 and is at this time only 12 years old when his father first conquers England. But with the rules of primogeniture, he is next in line. It does not matter in monarchies. It does not matter how old you are. You can become king when you are literally not even born yet. But as long as you're conceived, you're in the line of succession. That happened in France with Jean the First. But generally, you can take the throne at 3 months old. You can take the throne at 97 years old. Doesn't matter how old you are. As long as you're the next in line, you can still become king. So, yeah, by the way, I don't own the rights to any of these images, so don't, attack me for that. So, Robert Curthos de Normandy. That was his, what he's known as right here, this man. Let me pull up a pointer so I can show you. So here's a laser pointer. So William the Conqueror's eldest son is this guy named Robert. He was born in 1054. He is currently in line of succession. Now, there was no title for the heir to the throne back in the 1000s, in the 11th century. The title Prince of Wales didn't show up until Edward the First in the 1290s when he conquered Scotland and Wales. When he conquered Wales in 1290, whatever. I don't remember the exact years, in the 1290s. So that was way after this, about 200 years after this. So this is the current heir apparent, is Robert. Eldest son, pretty standard. The number 2 in line currently is a man named Richard of Normandy. Richard of Normandy is the second son of William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror had in total 4 sons in total. These were the 2 oldest. Actually, his 4th son at this point wasn't even born yet. So for those of you that know your English history, you know that Richard nor Robert actually became king. Circumstances happened with them not inheriting the throne. So in 1066, when William the Conqueror first takes the throne of England, his current heir is Robert, and his second is Richard, both of his sons. So now I fast forward, we got 1067. I got all the dates. 1068, he has his final son. 1069, 1070. So that carries through with the rest of the 1060s. So now we're going to jump up to 1074, where things start to change a little bit. So 1073 is the last year of static. The heirs stay the same until 1074, because in 1074, Richard dies at the age of 20. He's 20 years old, and Richard dies. So William the Conqueror's second son is killed in 1074. So he dies without any kids. So the next in line, oh, by the way, Robert has no kids at this point. William the Conqueror has no grandchildren at this point. And remember, males always take precedence over females. So there's almost never going to be any females in these early part of the history inheriting the throne until later on. Because queens in Europe back in the 11th century were very rare. Almost never happened because of medieval sexism. Again, the Middle Ages is a period I would consider between 800 and 1400, what I consider the Middle Ages. Now, these medieval kings, I mean, they're gruesome. But Richard dies in 1074, leaving the third son as the second in line now. His name is William Rufus. He's known as William Rufus. He was just William back then. He's known as William Rufus to us now, and he might be familiar to some of you. So yes, that's 1074, and William the Conqueror's eldest son, Robert, is still kicking. So now we move up to the rest of the 1070s, not much changes. Till we get to 1087. 1087 is the last year. William the Conqueror dies in 1087. Now there's a problem with this. Now remember how I said William the Conqueror holds 2 titles. He is the Duke of Normandy and the King of England. Now, he wanted on his deathbed, or I don't know if it was on his deathbed, but in his will, he's decided to separate his realms because France and England are pretty far apart, and so he wanted to give his eldest son, Robert, right here, the title of the Duke of Normandy. So Robert inherits the Norman title, and he hands the King of England to his second son, or actually his third son in this case, but second in line, William. So William will become king after Conqueror dies, and Robert will become the Duke of Normandy. Now, Robert actually ended up living in all the way until the year 1135. So had he become king, history might have played a little bit different. By 1088, William II is on the throne, as you can see, because he gave his second son the title of king. So by 1088, he's on the throne. William II has no kids. He never marries, never has any kids, even at this point. But he's fairly young at this point. He's about 32, which is not too young, but he has a brother. His younger brother is Henry, right here. Now, Henry is the youngest son of William the Conqueror, the fourth son. At this point, he's about 20 years old. Henry, it was Prince Henry at this point. He was born in Yorkshire. He was the youngest son of William the Conqueror. Then, the third in line is a woman by the name of Constance. This is, no, not Constance. Cecilia, Holy Trinity, Princess of England. Now, Cecilia is about the same age as William II. She is actually older than Henry here, but Henry takes precedence over her because he's a male. But she, the Holy Princess Cecilia, she is the second in line after William II, and then his brother Henry, and then his sister. So we got 1089, now we're in the 1090s. 1090, something changes because 1090. Fact check myself here real quick. This is Robert de Caen. Now, Caen, I didn't really fact check myself. He was illegitimate, I think. So he would not actually be in the line of succession. But just because of this case, I didn't know when I made this slideshow. I made this slideshow months ago. Just keep in mind that this guy, Robert here, he is the son of Henry. He is actually illegitimate. But I just didn't know that he won't end up inheriting the throne because stuff will go down. I believe that's him. Now, William II is currently king. His brother and his nephew are now his heirs. So now we move on to the rest of the 1090s, 1095. Now, 1095, I took Robert off the list because I realized he was illegitimate, but I didn't feel like going back and change it. So, William the Conqueror. There's a new baby that's born in 1096 named Stephen of Blois. Stephen is related to, he is a grandson of William the Conqueror from previous, through Adele of Normandy. No, I was completely wrong back there. This is actually not Henry I's son. Henry I did not have, this is Henry I, by the way, spoiler alert. Henry here did not have any kids in 1090. He had kids, but he didn't have legitimate kids. By the way, what I mean by a legitimate son is, a legitimate son is somebody that, when he had a child with his wife, with the queen, or his wife, that's a legitimate child. An illegitimate child is a mistress. So they had a lot of mistresses back in the day. So that's who this is. This right here is a man actually by the name of Thibault Legrand. He was born in 1090 and is actually related because he is the grandson of William the Conqueror. William II and Henry I here had a sister named Adele of Normandy. She was the youngest daughter of William the Conqueror. Her son was this guy. So that's how he's in there. Stupid flying it out of here. So that goes in. But in 1096, he has a brother that's born, which is Stephen of Blois. Now, Stephen actually takes precedence over him for some reason. I don't really know why that is. But he's already, none of the Blois, they were already in charge of, they were like French or something. But Stephen is a new baby. He's actually newborn at this point in 1096. William II is still on the throne, but he's now second in line. He is also Adele of Normandy's son. So he's a grandson of William the Conqueror, the nephew of William II, the nephew of these two. Okay, 1097, 1098, 1099, 1100. Now we're into the 1100s, but in 1100, William II dies. Therefore, the succession moves up. Now, Henry, his brother, is now king. He is King Henry I. Henry I is officially on the throne now, and William, supposedly he might have gotten murdered, William II, but we're not going into that right now. Just basics. Henry I is now on the throne in 1101. His heir is still Stephen of Blois. Stephen of Blois. Because he's the nephew. And again, Henry I has no legitimate kids by 1101 at this point. You're wondering who this guy is here? On this person? This person is Henry of Blois. This is Henry of Blois. This is the younger brother of King Stephen. He was born in 1099. Stephen was born in 1096. He was born in 1099. So by 1101, Henry I is on the throne. His heir is Stephen, and then Stephen of Blois has a younger brother named Henry of Blois. 1102 happens. Now, in 1102, Henry I has an official child, Matilda. Now, Matilda, she's known as Empress Matilda because she later marries the Holy Roman Emperor, and then she goes back and then marries a man named Geoffrey Plantagenet. That is very important. Matilda should have became queen, honestly, but she didn't because, medieval sexism, as I talked about earlier, but she plays a major part in the later kings of England because they go through her line. So by 1102, she's born, which bumps Stephen, since she's actually the daughter of Henry I, that bumps his nephew Stephen down to second in line. So by 1103, the next year, Henry I gives birth to he doesn't give birth, his wife gives birth. He has a son. Now, this son, let me see, was born in 1103. Now, he takes precedence over Matilda, his sister, because, males take precedence. He's known as William Adelin. Now, Henry I actually had a lot of illegitimate children, but William of Adelin, William, his heir, something very tragic happens to him later down the line in 1120, but we'll show you what happens. So the succession should stay about the same right now because Henry I only has one son throughout his whole period. So we can go through the rest of the 1100s, and we get to 1110, 1111. What a great year that was. Then we move to 1120. 1120, tragic strikes. There is William, the son of Henry I, his only son, is on a ship called the White Ship. And there was a horrible disaster in the storm. They were partying, having a drunk party on a ship one night in November of 1120. And right off the coast of France, in Normandy, which these guys are all part of the Norman house. This kills the Norman line when he died. And William is killed. Henry I's only son is killed in that accident. And it was said that Henry was so demoralized by that defeat, death of his son, that he did not smile the rest of his life. He only lived 15 years after this, but he was depressed over the loss of his son. And that really turned the English succession into a crisis. Now remember, literally, William's about 17 years old when this happened, so he's officially gone. So by 1121, his sister Matilda is now first in line once again, and Stephen is back in the fray. Now, Stephen is about to get really greedy because he sees that there is no male ahead of him, because there was a male in 1120, but once William died, he sees that the only person standing in his way from the throne is Matilda. And since he's a man, these women here have no power in the 1100s at all. So he thinks that once Henry I dies, he's going to go against Matilda, take her out, so he can become king of England. So not much changes as for the succession in the 1120s. But once we get to 1130, stuff happens. Now, Stephen, all of his hopes and dreams kind of die when this happens in 1133 because Matilda has a son with Geoffrey Plantagenet. Now, Geoffrey Plantagenet was from a really old royal house called the House of Anjou. Anjou is French. That's why a lot of the early Plantagenet kings were known as the Angevin monarchs during their time. Plantagenet was kind of a later thing, but she married Geoffrey Plantagenet and had a son with him in 1133 named Henry. Henry later becomes Henry II later down the line, but this is Henry right here. Matilda's son. So Stephen now has something in his way. In 1132, he's feeling fine, but by 1133, Henry's born. Henry I has his grandson. So Henry I has his daughter and his grandson. But Matilda does. Now you're probably like, oh, I thought males took precedence. Now that's only if they're on the same generation, because Matilda actually will take precedence over her son, Henry II. 1134, nothing happens. 1135. 1135, Henry I dies. The king dies. So you're thinking now, oh, well, Henry I, he does want his daughter to become queen, so the line can trace down through him. But Stephen, good old Stephen back here, he's not having it. He is not having it. So, when Henry I dies, a civil war starts in England. It was one of the first civil wars since the Norman invasion. Stephen and the Blois go against Matilda in a civil war. And by then, Matilda just does not have enough stance to hold over. And Stephen takes the throne from Matilda. Greedy Stephen. This is the first time in English history so far that we have had somebody steal the throne and right of greed. So Stephen now in 1136 is now in there. Funny enough, though, Henry II is still third in line because Stephen himself does not have any kids. He's known as King Stephen. There's never been a Stephen since. He was also a horrible monarch. So he's still third in line, even though Matilda's kicked out of here. Because once Matilda died here, Stephen took Matilda way off the line of succession after that point. But his brother, Henry of Blois, he's next in line, of course. And Henry II is still, he's 3 years old. He probably has no idea what's going on. But he is third in line at the throne. 1137, 1130, 1139, 1140, 1141. Now, Matilda actually manages to take an army into a battle and defeat Stephen and becomes queen in 1141. But this is so brief that I didn't put it on here. She only ruled for a few months, a little over. She did rule from 1141 to 1142, but Stephen eventually took the throne back from her. Stephen reigns until his death with no problems. But once Stephen dies, things are going to get complicated again. Because his brother here, Henry, Stephen, of course, doesn't have any kids. Well, he might have kids, but he doesn't have. So everybody knows at this point, nobody likes Stephen. Nobody likes Stephen Blois. He's horrible. He's a horrible person to England. And everybody just wants the Norman line back. So they grab Matilda. Matilda's still alive, but she doesn't become queen. They actually take her son, Henry. Now, Henry, by this point, is about, it was 1154 was the last year of his reign. He's about 21 at this point. So Henry II is definitely able to reign. So once Stephen dies, Henry II takes the throne. And this person here, Henry of Blois, he's just completely skipped over because of the succession. What happens now? So Henry II is now on the throne in 1155. So Matilda, his mom, is still alive. Now, Henry I was obviously the grandson of, or Henry II is obviously the grandson of Henry I. Now, Henry II was a great king. Did a great job at sustaining England, bringing it back to its Norman roots, even though he was not Norman, he was Angevin. I'm just giving some snaps, so don't mind me, guys. All right, we're almost done. Just 2 more to go. Whatever. Okay, so this right here, Henry II is now king in 1155. He has his son here. He was obviously, the son of Geoffrey Plantagenet and Matilda, so he's now king. Now, he had a really good claim to the throne. So They let Stephen rule until his death. They can have Stephen. Stephen gets all the fun he wants until he dies. But then things got to go back to how it was. So 1155, they just couldn't kick Stephen out of there. They were having problems getting Stephen out of there. But they eventually did, and Henry II's back on. So things are back on track now. But Henry II, his eldest son is a guy named William de Poitiers. He is the eldest son of Henry II. Now, at this point, he's only about 2 years old, and he doesn't live long because he dies at age 3. But he, as it stands, he's going to die the next year in 1156. His 3-year-old son's going to die, and that's Henry II's heir right now. And then he has his second son. He's got a second son at this point, and he's literally a newborn baby. His name is Henry, named after his father. He is known as Henry the Young King because he does rule alongside his father, Henry II, later. But William dies in 1156, leaving Henry the son now as the heir. But Henry II, 1157, has a new son named Richard. Now, Richard is basically known as Richard the Lionheart, if you've ever heard of him. Now, Richard is going to play a major role later on in history. But he's not king right now. This is basic, just family stuff. So Henry the Young King, he rules alongside Henry II, but he doesn't really have much power, but he does kind of reign jointly with Henry II. Things go by 1160s. Pass, not much changes until we get to 1184. 1183 is when Henry dies. Henry Plantagenet, Henry II's son, dies in 1183 without any kids. So now in 1184, the succession changes to the next eldest son, Richard. Richard is now the heir. Now, Henry II had a lot of kids, so the next in line is a man named Geoffrey. He's known as Geoffrey II because he had some title. He was the, let's see here, the Duke of Brittany. This guy was the second Duke of Brittany because he was one of the sons of Henry II. But his eldest son currently is Richard, who's now in line. But things don't last long for Geoffrey being in the line of succession because he dies in 1186. Then in 1187, the youngest son of Henry II, John and Richard, he becomes the next second in line heir. He was born in 1166. 1166, so he is 21 at this point. And Richard I doesn't have any kids at this point, even though he is still he's 30 years old. I don't know why these guys, I don't know. But that's John. He's now third in line. The two sons of Henry II, Richard and John. So Henry II is still alive in 1187, but he's about to die here. 1189, Henry II, the king, dies after a pretty long reign of about over 30 years. Henry II, it was a great reign for him, but all things come to an end at some point. So in 1190, Richard, his son, becomes king after long waited. He is Richard the Lionheart. He spends about 6 months in England during his entire reign in the 1190s. Richard, he's known as Richard I. He's a big crusader king. He had many conquests in France, Scotland, everywhere. And he eventually dies in 1199 after being shot by he was going in an expedition in France, conquered a lot of land there. He was killed by a crossbow fired by a cook on the castle of France. So that was kind of not good end for him. But in 1190, John, his brother, is second in line because he doesn't have any kids. And then this man over here is quite far off in the family, to say the least. But he is a grandson, I believe, of Henry II. Yes, I'm right. He is Henry V of Brunswick. He is the Henry II back here had a daughter. His eldest daughter's name was Matilda Plantagenet, named him after his mom. She had a son who was Henry V of Brunswick. So he was actually now the heir, the second heir. But they're not worried about him right now because John is now the main source of attention as the heir because he's, in line. So Richard I is still king. Now, he rolls through the 1190s. He doesn't reign long, actually. He dies in 1199. So by 1200, John is now king of England. John does not have any kids at 1200, so Henry is now actually the heir to the throne. Henry V of Brunswick. Now, Henry V of Brunswick has a son known as Heinrich von Sachsen. These guys actually were, I believe, I don't even know if he was from, these guys were German. So he has actually lived in the Holy Roman Empire. He had nothing to do with England. But how rules work, had King John died in 1200, he's known as King John. He signed the Magna Carta, by the way, for those of you that don't know. Had King John have died in 1200, Henry of the Holy Roman Empire would have become King of England. And then he has a son named Heinrich von Sachsen, who is now the heir, the second heir. Now, John doesn't have any kids until 1207. 1207, King John actually has a son named Henry, and he will later become Henry III. Nicolas, if you're watching this video, you love Henry III, and I know it. It's his favorite monarch. But he is now the king. Or he's now the heir, number one heir, Henry III, when he was born in 1207. And Henry V of Brunswick, still second in line until we get to 1209, because King John has another son. 1209, the second son, by the name of Richard of Cornwall. Richard of Cornwall was the second son of John. So John's got two. He's got a nice succession going with his son Henry and John of Cornwall. Or, I don't know, Richard of Cornwall. 1210. Magna Carta gets signed in 1215. 1216, though, King John dies at the age of 60. No, 50. He's only 50, actually. So his son, Henry III, becomes king. Henry becomes king at age 9. He's 9 years old when he becomes king in 1217. Well, he actually becomes king in 1216, but the French king Louis VIII actually takes over for a while because he takes advantage of Henry III being so young, powerless. But Henry III does take back the throne eventually. Then his brother Richard of Cornwall is now his heir because he doesn't have any kids. Obviously, he's 9 freaking years old. If you have kids at 9, you honestly, there's something wrong there. And this is his sister, Joan Plantagenet. So his brother and his sister are the heirs. They're children right now because John died young. So this is his sister Joan, and then his brother is now the heir. So with the rest of the 1210s, now we're into 1220. Not much happens, honestly, because Henry III is going to go on to reign for a very long time. He ruled for over 50 years. He was the longest king until King George III beat his record in 1816. But in 1231, Joan, something happens to her. Richard of Cornwall, I believe, might have a son. Yes, in 1232, Joan is now kicked out in favor of Richard of Cornwall, has a son named John de Cornwall. John did not live long. He was eventually died at age 1. He was born in 1232, died in 1233. So Joan is back in the case. 1235, though, Richard de Cornwall has another son named Henry de Almaine. And he actually lived to be pretty decently. He didn't live old. He lived to be 35, but he outlived to actually hold a position in something. 1230s, the 1230s go by. Their sister Joan dies in 1238. But now in 1239, Henry III, the king, has a son named Edward. Now, Edward's known as Edward Longshanks. He was very tall. He was about 6'2", which is a massive in the 1200s. 6'2" in the 1200s is actually insane. Something like that. He was ridiculously tall for the 1200s. So that's Edward, his son. Now Richard is now the second in line because Henry's son is going to take precedence over his brother, over his uncle. The younger take precedence over all of them. So that's in 1239. 1240s go by. Henry III has a daughter in 1240 named Margaret Plantagenet. And she's now second in line. That goes on until 1245 when Henry III has a second son named Edmund. Edmund is now the second son behind Edward. So he has that good going just in case something happens to Edward. That way Edmund is ready to take the throne if needed. The rest of the 1240s go by, 1250s. Not much happens. Henry III is on the throne for a ridiculously long time. Remember, we're in 1264 right now. Henry III has been on the throne since 1216. Now, in 1269, Edward I has a son, or has a daughter named, no, he doesn't. Yes, he does, named Eleanor. Eleanor, right here, is Edward I's son. So now Henry III's got a granddaughter that's now in the line of succession. Now we're at 1270s, 1271, 1272. Now in 1272, Henry III finally dies after a ridiculously long reign. He had been on the throne since 1216. He doesn't die until 1272. He's on the throne forever, Henry III. He is finally dying in 1272, leaving his son, Edward, as the new king. King Edward I, Edward Longshanks, Hammer of the Scot, Conqueror of the Welsh. He's now king. Eleanor is his daughter, is the eldest daughter. He has no sons right now. He's got two daughters, though. He's got Joan of Arc. This is Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc is pretty famous because she married a man named Gilbert de Clare and Ralph Mortimer. The Mortimer family, Joan of Arc, is pretty famous. But she's not the heir to the English throne. She was actually second in line because her older sister Eleanor, born in 1269, takes precedence. She was born in 1272. She was born the same year Henry III died. That's now the succession. Until we get to 1284. 1284, Edward I moves Joan of Arc down a place. Now she's now fourth in line, third in line. And Eleanor gets jumped down a place because Edward I has a son named Edward. Edward becomes the first Prince of Wales. Prince of Wales is a title given to the eldest son of the monarch. And Edward II here becomes the first Prince of Wales in the 1290s once Edward I conquers Wales, takes out the last Welsh Prince of Wales, as well as William Wallace, whatever his name is, to a punishment known as hanging, drawing, and quartering. Edward I was the first monarch of England to issue that. He was pretty brutal, but he got a lot done in his reign. Scotland, we get through the 1280s, now we're into the 1290s. He has now conquered Scotland for a little bit, and he actually ends up ruling Scotland. Edward I ends up ruling Scotland for about 2 years. He holds on to that throne until they eventually take it back, the Scottish kings. Then he conquers Wales and makes Edward here the Prince of Wales, officially stating him as his heir. So now we get to 1298. And 1298, Eleanor passes away without any kids. So in 1299, we now get back on Joan of Arc is now in the line of succession behind her brother Edward. Edward I only had one son in total, but he had a lot of daughters. Now we're into 1300. Now we're into 1300. We're getting to the late Middle Ages. This is where stuff starts to go down in the 1300s. 1301, 1302, the 1300s go the same until 1307. The Joan of Arc, yeah, comes back in there. He rules until, I believe, 1307. That's when Edward I dies. He's got no grandkids at this time. Edward, the Prince of Wales, is only about in his 20s. He's not very old. But he will become king in 1307 now, after this guy dies here. But it's not the only thing that happens in 1307, because Joan of Arc also dies in 1307. So Edward I and Joan of Arc both die. But Edward, the Prince of Wales, now becomes King Edward II. He is now the king, now in 1308. His heir currently is pretty complicated in how they're related, because since he didn't have any sons, his heir now is going to be... I gotta find it because I don't even know. Joan of Arc had son, Gilbert. This is Gilbert de Clare. This was Joan of Arc's right here. She died in 1307, and so did Edward I. Died in 1307. Her son is now the heir to Edward II as his nephew in 1309. So now he's the heir. The second in line would be Gilbert's sister, Margaret. I think. Because he doesn't have any kids at this point. He doesn't have a kid till 1312. This is Margaret de Clare Audley. She is now second in line in 1309, but these guys are weird. This is Joan of Arc's two kids. Joan of Arc was the sister of Edward II. So we get to 1312. In 1312, Edward II has his son, his eldest son, Edward. Edward plays a major part in European history later down the line. This is Edward, his son. He has a son. Now, he was not that old in 1312. That's the year he was born. Now, Gilbert is now bumped down a place. Gilbert still has a fair chance at the throne. 1313, 1314, in 1315, Edward II has another son. Usually they have a lot of kids at once. So that is Edward II's second son, who is behind Edward, his eldest son, becoming the Prince of Wales, by the name of John Plantagenet of Eltham. He is now in line behind Edward's son. So now we go through the next 1310s. Actually, this is 1315. I have no idea who this is, by the way. Maybe this is that. You know what I'm thinking is, I think Gilbert. Somebody had another child. I think it was like one of Edward II's older sisters actually had a son, and he was only in line for a year. But then Edward II has a son named John, and he is now the second in line in 1316. So we're going to keep going. We get to 1319, 1320. In 1326, 1327, Edward II dies, and he's pretty young when he dies. He didn't live long. He was basically earlier in 1327. Tragic happens because his wife basically was cheating on him. The Queen of England, Edward II's wife. Her name was who was it? I think her name was Eleanor too, but I really don't know. No, it was Isabella of France. He married a French princess, the daughter of who was it? Philippe IV. And she was famously the sister of like Louis X and Charles IV and all those guys, which eventually started the 100-Year War with that marriage. She was the aunt of Jean I too. But yeah, she was the sister of Charles IV and Louis X, those famous kings of France. He married her. So that's where Edward III makes his claim on being the grandson of Philippe IV. But Isabella of France has an affair, I guess, and he cheats on Edward II with a man named Roger Mortimer. Roger Mortimer and her work together and actually end up deposing, which deposing means basically kicking out Edward II. They kick out Edward II in 1327. So he is basically a lame duck. He's still alive until September of 1327. He dies a few months later, but he's still alive. He's not the king. They imprison Edward II, and then he gets executed. Actually, I don't know if he got executed. He might have just died, but he died, and that was what happened. So, you know, of course, the 15-year-old son, Edward III, is now the king, of course, at this point. But his mom highly controls him because of how young he is. and she uses Roger Mortimer to basically they basically rule, and not Edward III. They recognize Edward III's the king, but they're like, you can be king all you want, but you're not going to control anybody. We're going to control people. So he was done being influenced by his mom and her lover, that he sneaks into Roger Mortimer's bedroom with some people. He gets some people to go in, sneaks into their bedroom in the middle of the night in 1327, grabs Roger, takes him, and executes him. Says, no, I'm the king of England, not you. I am the son of the previous monarch that you deposed. I'm done with this bull crap. So that's what Edward III does, and now he becomes king. Edward III makes that huge move there, and becomes the king now. John, right here, is still the heir to Edward III because he doesn't have any kids at this point. John is now the heir, and this is Edward III's sister over here, named her name is, I believe this is Eleanor of Woodstock. This is Eleanor of Woodstock right here. That is Edward III's sister. She's second in line. We get 1329, 1330s. In 1330, Edward III has his first son named Edward. He names him Edward right after him. He becomes the Prince of Wales. He is known as Edward the Black Prince. Edward the Black Prince is the son of Edward III. He very famously, he's the first Prince of Wales to actually not become king. Stuff happens with him, but he is basically set in stone to become king. Everybody knows this guy's going to be Edward IV. He's going to be so good. He was very famous during the 100 Years' War. He was a great general during that war, and that bumps his brother down to second in line after Edward the Black Prince. He has him in 1330. In 1334, Edward III has another child. He has a daughter named his daughter is named Isabel de Courcy. That's her. And that goes the rest of the 1330s until we get to 1338, when Edward III creates the Duke titles. Not in 1338, but he was the first king to include those. He decided to give more power to his sons. He had 5 sons in total. His second son, Lionel, right here, becomes the Duke of Clarence and he's after his eldest son, Edward the Black Prince. Edward the Black Prince is first in line still, and Edward III's king, and then Lionel, the Duke of Clarence. So this all happens 1339. We're now in 1340s. Not much happens here. Edward III goes on to reign quite a long time. 100 Years' War is in full swing right now. It's France. In 1366, though, 1367, Edward the Black Prince has a son named Richard II. He becomes Richard II. Edward the Black Prince has a son. So this is Edward III's grandson, Richard. That's why he passes up Lionel. So Edward the Black Prince and Richard. So this is a nice direct male line. This is a very healthy for a monarchy to have right now. So Edward the Black Prince and then his son, Richard. This is not his brother. This is literally his son. Now remember, he's going to take precedence over all of his other sons because he is the eldest son of the eldest son. 1368 goes by 1369, 1370s. In 1376, though, Edward the Black Prince dies, and is not good because at this point his son Richard is not very old. He's about 10 years old, and Edward the Black Prince dies, leaving Richard now the heir to the throne. Now you're like, you might say, well, who's this guy here? Well, this is Edward III's third son, John of Gaunt. Now you're probably asking, what happened to Lionel? Well, Lionel actually ended up dying in 1368, the year after Richard II was born. So the third son now, John of Gaunt, he's the Duke of Lancaster. He is now the heir, second heir. But you're probably like, oh, he was the next son. Shouldn't he become king over him? Because that was the firstborn son of a firstborn son actually takes precedence over all older male siblings, because since he was the son of the Black Prince, Richard II was, so now he's in line after Edward III. But in 1377, Edward III croaks. Edward III is done. Therefore, Richard II is now on the throne. And he doesn't have any kids, obviously. He's really young. So John of Gaunt is now his heir, is the uncle. And then his first cousin over here is Henry Bolingbroke, who will eventually become the Duke of Lancaster. And he's going to try to take the throne from Richard. Now, Richard was on to rule for a little bit. Richard was a very unpopular king. Nobody liked Richard II because of the Peasants' Revolt that's happening right now in the 1380s. Until eventually we get to 1399. 1399 is when John of Gaunt dies. Well, stuff happens. 1399, John of Gaunt dies. And therefore the title Duke of Lancaster passes down to Henry IV. Henry IV was already the heir anyway, but he was decided, you know, we're going to throw out Richard II because I don't like him. And nobody likes him anyway. So Richard II is off an expedition in Ireland right now, trying to conquer some land. Henry Bolingbroke over here, who's the son of John of Gaunt. John of Gaunt dies in February of 1399. So Henry Bolingbroke goes over, grabs an army, takes them in, and when Richard II gets back, he meets him in London, kicks him out. They capture the king, Richard II, take him to the Tower of London, and execute him in February of 1400. And then Henry IV becomes king because nobody even liked Henry. They're like, you know what? We don't like Richard. We don't really like Richard II anyway, so we're just gonna let you do that. So Henry IV now becomes king. It's Henry IV. Henry has a son at this point named Henry as well, right here. And then he has another son, I believe. I don't know if that's actually he might not. I don't know who this guy is. In 1401, where we're at right now. Guess we'll find out who that is. Henry IV. This right there is Thomas Plantagenet. This is Thomas Plantagenet. I think. And this is 1401, so now he's the second in line after Henry V. Henry IV keeps reigning. Now he's like very, switched to the Lancasters, which eventually starts the 100 Years' War. Or not the 100 Years' Wars, the Wars of the Roses. So he reigns till his death in 1413. In 1413, his eldest son, Henry, becomes King Henry V. He was a very good king. Now we're in 1414. He was a very good king. He conquered a lot of land in France, more than any other monarch had done before. Henry V is one of my favorites. But he comes to the throne because, it's pretty simple. He's the eldest son of Henry IV. So he just becomes Henry V in 1414. Now, he died in 1413, but becomes king on March 21st of 1413. So yeah, that's in 1414, which is my birthday. That's the only reason I know that. That's not the only reason, but you know what I'm saying. 1414. So his brother is next in line, of course, because Henry V doesn't have any kids at this point. I don't think he does, at least. No, he only had one child, ever. So that is still Thomas Plantagenet. And then the second in line would be his other brother, who is younger, John. His name is John. That's how line of succession goes until we get to 1421. 1421, Henry V has a son named Henry. He names him Henry. He will later become Henry VI. So that bumps his brother down to second in line after Henry V. But in 1422, but also in 1421, Henry VI, Henry right here, his new young son, he's born in like December. His brother, Henry V's brother here, dies, leaving John back in the line in 1422. But in 1422, dysentery happens to Henry V. He dies at a very young age. He dies he's very young. And he has a newborn son. He is a 9-month-old. And the 9-month-old Henry VI becomes king. Now, Henry VI was an absolute disaster to England. He was just horrendous. So the Wars of the Roses start because of him. He goes absolutely catatonic during his reign because he has huge bouts of mental madness, probably what they would call it. That he just didn't really know how to rule, and his wife pretty much had to do a lot of ruling for him. And probably the only reason they had a wife was just to keep the wealth. You know, they did all those marriages. That's like, he was not good. But he actually ruled for a very long time. He was on the throne for a long time, too, because he was 9 months old when he became king. This right here is his uncle John, and then his uncle Humphrey. Humphrey is now second in line to the throne after Henry VI. Now, imagine how you'd feel if you're a grown freaking man and you were about to become king, but your brother had a 9-month-old child that took precedence and became king, and you didn't get it. That would suck. But these guys weren't really greedy. They just kept the line because they know, they follow the rules. That's how it works, which is rare enough. 1424 and 1436. 1435, John dies, leaving now Henry VI's uncle. Humphrey is now second in line, because Henry VI doesn't have any kids at this point. Remember, he's really young. He's like 15. So this is now Humphrey. Humphrey is the brother of Henry V, previously, son of Henry IV of Lancaster. That's why they're called the House of Lancaster in the Red Rose during the Wars of the Roses. So now this guy, to find second in line was pretty difficult, because Humphrey didn't have any kids, John didn't have any kids, and then the previous guy didn't have any kids either. So this guy, Henry VI, on the throne, so he dies in 1435, while Henry VI is king. So a lot of this stuff happens, and you guys don't really know much about it. So Henry IV has a lot of illegitimate half siblings. So we're gonna go John de Beaufort. We're gonna do him. How did I get to that line? Say. Let me check, guys. I gotta find this guy here. This man here is now second in line after Humphrey. Humphrey obviously takes. He's just the uncle of Henry the Fifth. Now he's Duarte the First of Portugal, the King of Portugal. He was born in 1391. This is 1436. He's now actually second in line to the English throne because of what crisis they're going through right now in England. Which eventually leads to the Wars of the Roses, but the guy who takes him ever ain't even alive yet. So Duarte the First of Portugal is now second in line to the English throne, which is pretty cool. In 1430, he dies in 1438, leaving his son Alfonso V, Alfonso el Cinco. He actually takes the throne of Portugal in 1439, but he's not king of England. But he's still in the line of succession to the English throne, but he's still behind Humphrey. So the only way he's going to become king is if Henry VI, something happens to Humphrey too, and Henry VI. He's probably doesn't care too much, though, just because he's already king of Portugal. So, but England's a very powerful state. Now we're into the 1440s. 1447, Humphrey dies. So now Alfonso V is now actually the heir to the English throne. So if Henry VI were to die in 1447, 1448, Alfonso V would have become the King of England, which would have been kind of crazy to have a Portuguese monarch become the King of England. The next in line is actually Alfonso's heir, too. Alfonso's the heir to Henry VI, and he might not even known it. Alfonso is the heir to Henry VI, and then Alfonso has a son himself named... no, he doesn't have a son. He has a brother named Fernando. Fernando is Portugal. He is now the heir to Alfonso V. Alfonso V is king of Portugal, of course, and then it's Henry VI in 1449. In 1452, though, Alfonso has a daughter. Alfonso V has a daughter named Joanna Princesa. Joanna Princesa, 1452. But that doesn't last long because in well, actually, you know what? In 1452, Alfonso V dies. No, he does not. Joanna el Princesa, whatever you want to call her, Joanna Princesa. But in 1453, Henry VI actually has a son, finally, named Edward of Westminster, and becomes Prince of Wales. So Henry VI did manage to finally actually pick up himself a legitimate biological descendant to actually inherit the throne, so it didn't have to go to the Portuguese which would not have been good. Well, I'm not saying it would have been bad, because we probably would have avoided the Wars of the Roses, but it would have stirred up some stuff in the 1450s. Let me tell you. So 1454 happens, 1455. Alfonso is still second in line because Edward of Westminster is really young at this point. So if anything happens to Henry VI, I mean, Alfonso is really in a good spot right now. This happens 1458, 1459. However, though, in now at this point in the 1450s, I think it's about 1457, there's a guy by the name of Richard of York who decides, you know what? I'm going to get rid of Henry VI and become king myself. So we have a conquest person trying to get in there and take out Henry VI so he can become king. He's a guy named Richard of York. He does have a stance on the throne because he is actually, there was a fourth son of Edward III. If we go all the way back to Edward III, which we'll go back to here, all the way back to Edward III, this guy, remember, his eldest son was the Black Prince. Now, we're going back like almost 70 years at this point. Edward the Black Prince. His second son was Lionel, of course. Lionel, right here. Third son was John of Gaunt. So let's fast forward. John of Gaunt. He's in line right here. John of Gaunt. John of Gaunt, you know. And then there's the fourth son. His name is Edmund of York. He's the Duke of York, but he's never in the line of succession. But this guy, Richard, later on, decides that he's going to try to take over. I think it's in 1457 when it happens. He's going to take over Henry VI because he knows Henry VI is mentally unstable, and he knows that his son Edward is so young that that's not going to pose a problem. So he builds up an army, and he starts out, being chill. He just wants to be Lord Protector. Basically, he wants to be the guy in charge when Henry's having these madness and he can't reign, or when he can't, rule, I guess. He wants to be the guy in charge because he thinks the guy they're putting in charge isn't doing a very good job. But then he eventually gets mad, it escalates, and then he starts putting in battles. And then there's battles. He gets killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1460, 1459, I can't remember. The War of the Roses happens, and the Lancasters right here continue to hold power for a little bit. But in 1461, the Battle of Towton happens. The bloodiest battle ever fought on English grounds, on English soil, happens. The Battle of Towton. I really want to go to the Towton battlefield sometime, but Henry VI gets defeated. He doesn't die, though. He gets defeated by Edward. So that wipes out not only Henry VI himself, but also his son Edward and Alfonso. They're out of line. In 1462, Edward IV, he's the son of Richard, the Duke of York. He now is the king. He defeats him at the Battle of Towton. The bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. That is him. So now he's the king. So he's got completely new heirs and everything because he's on a different side of the tree. This guy's kind of crazy. So this is Edward IV now. He was born in 1442, died in 1471. So his heirs right now is his brother. First of all, George Plantagenet, he's the Duke of Clarence. That's his brother. He doesn't have any kids. Edward himself doesn't have any kids at this point. This is the House of York now. York has taken over the Lancasters in the Wars of the Roses. Edmund right here. No, what's his name? Duke of Clarence right here is this first in line, and then he has another younger brother named Richard. This is George. George eventually gets denounced his rights to the throne later on because he gets screwed over by Richard III. Well, you'll see why he's called Richard III. That's Richard. He is now in line as well. 1462. Go on through the 1460s. Now, remember, all through the 1460s, the Lancasters are trying to get Henry VI back on the throne. It's a war between those two individuals. In 1466, Edward IV has a daughter named Elizabeth. She's known as Elizabeth of York, which bumps his younger brother George down to second in line, and then Richard completely off charts, which Richard does not like. He's kind of mad right now. 1467, he has another daughter by the name of good old Cicely Plantagenet. So that's her. And then in 1469. In 1470, he He has a son named Edward. He names him after him. That's who eventually become Edward V, and then that bumps Cecilia down to 1469, 1470 down to that. Now Elizabeth is the second line after Edward IV. So in 1471, though, the Lancasters end up defeating the Yorks. They get Henry VI back on the throne briefly. So the succession is still the same. Edward of Westminster is his son, and then Alfonso of Portugal's back in the fray. Not for long, though, because they eventually do capture Henry VI, and they're like, we're done with this guy. We need to stop fighting. And then they execute Henry VI, basically taking this guy out of the succession as a whole, and actually end up killing Edward too, his son. They don't care about Alfonso at all. He's just the ruler of Portugal. You're just going to die, because once these two die, this guy has no chance of becoming king. 1472. Well, as long as the Lancasters aren't on the throne, this guy's not becoming king. He only had a chance with these two. These were the only two he had in front of him, but Henry VI gets executed in 1471, either by Edward or Richard or somebody on that side of the family. In 1472, or somebody on their behalf, or whatever, 1472, Edward IV is back on the throne. He eventually takes out Henry VI for good, and that's done. So Edward V is his heir, and then Elizabeth is his second heir. 1473, Edward IV has another son named, I believe his name is Henry. Is it Henry? It's Richard. Richard's his son. Now, these two are known as the Princes in the Tower, which we'll get into later. These two, something very tragic happens to these two boys later on in 1483. That's in 1473. Not much happens throughout the 1470s. Edward IV continues to reign. He tries to establish this New York dynasty. In 1483, though, stuff goes the French down. So Edward IV dies in 1483. He has a 12-year-old son. Edward V is only 12 at this point. So he ends up becoming king at a very young age. And then his heir right now is Richard, his brother, and then Elizabeth, of course. But Elizabeth doesn't care. Or she's just, third. She's the daughter. Eldest daughter of Edward IV, previous king. But if you remember Richard, back here, this guy. Oh, shoot. I'm way going far ahead. Okay. Richard, remember back, this guy here. He was the younger brother of Edward IV. He wants, he's like, you know what? These nephews are pieces of crap. I'm getting rid of them. So what he does is he goes in, and Edward IV, he claims that Edward IV had an illegitimate marriage with a woman named Woodstock. I don't remember. It was Woodstock or something. But then he goes in, he's like, I'm going to kill Edward V, young Edward V. And Anthony Woodville is his uncle on his mom's side, and Richard III on his entourage intercepts Anthony Woodville on the way to his coronation. Edward V. He reigns for 2 months. Richard III captures Edward V, and Richard, the younger brother, traps him in the tower, and they're never to be seen again. They're known as the Princes in the Tower. They both die. And Richard, honestly, this guy here, who's doing it, his uncle, he doesn't give a crap about Elizabeth. He's like, this is a woman, who cares? But you're like, why is he doing it? And he gets precedence over George. Now, Richard III, had actually had him denounced of all his titles when he became king because he tried to conquer, and he didn't. And, then again, on his behalf, he did fight on the Lancaster side. He fought for Henry VI during the wars. So George was kind of a mean guy for that, and Richard stripped him of all of his titles after he took the throne very meanly. Very not cool. Third did, but he actually does that in 1484. He is now on the throne. Elizabeth's still she's chilling over here. She just doesn't care. But Richard III, it doesn't last long for him. He's got a son named. His son is a guy named Edward of Middleham. He dies in 1484, pretty young. And then in 1485, Richard III now does not have an heir. His heir is now Elizabeth, which is his niece. And then his other niece, Cecilia, is back in line. But in 1485, on August 22nd, which today's August 22nd, if you're watching this video on the day it came out, Richard III gets killed. It's actually like 537 years ago on this date. Richard III was killed at the Battle of Bosworth. He gets killed by a guy who is a descendant of John of Gaunt. Another Edward III, a guy named Henry the Seventh becomes king. He comes in and he's like, you know, Richard III's an idiot. So he gets taken over by Henry the Seventh. And he marries this woman here, Elizabeth, uniting the Yorks and the Lancasters, putting an end to the Wars of the Roses right there with this guy. So a lot of tragedy, a lot of crazy shenanigans were happening through this period here. But overall, eventually they put an end to it with Henry VII defeating Richard III, Battle of Bosworth Field. All right, so Henry VII marries her, and then he has a son at this point. Henry VII's heir is his son Arthur. Arthur was alive in 1486. I guess he was. I'm gonna look up Henry VII here. I love Henry VII. He was pretty cool. Born in 1457, died in 1509. So that's Henry VII right now. That's his son. But he descends from a really sketchy line through the Tudors. He's a Tudor king. He descends from illegitimate, claimed to be illegitimate. Henry IV claimed to be illegitimate back in the day. A guy named Beaufort. But he's like, yeah, he's legitimate, but his descendants are never allowed to be in the line of succession. But Henry VII did defeat Richard III in the Battle of Bosworth, so he kind of was doing that. So he has a son named Arthur. He's the Prince of Wales in 1486. Actually, that was surprisingly, the year he was born. He had an illegitimate son earlier, though. So that's him. Arthur is now his heir. This guy over here is the second in line. He is one of Henry VII. His father was Edmund Tudor. Margaret Beaufort. Margaret Beaufort was Henry VII's mother, and she's the one that he descends from the previous kings through. So she had her father was a guy named John Beaufort. His son, I'm trying to find John Beaufort, John de Beaufort, the Earl of Somerset. Let's see here, Thomas. Get to him here. Sir Edmund Beaufort. I can't even find this person. Gosh dang. Who is this guy? He's like the Earl of Somerset or something, if I remember right. I don't even know how I got to him. Let's just see here. John Beaufort. Margaret, so she had this guy. That was it. Okay, I'm trying to find who this person is, but this is second in line after Henry VII takes over. It's very crazy what goes on. But that guy, he's the Earl of Somerset or something. Let's see if Thomas had any kids. No, it wasn't him. Margaret? No, that wasn't Joan. Oh, she was King of Scotland. Queen of Scotland. I didn't know that. Beaufort. I guess we're just going to go down that. Man. Henry Beaufort. Wow, we're screwed up. He is barely related, this person here. I'm just going to tell you that. But he is somehow in line. I just don't know how. But that all changes in 1489 when Henry VII has a son named, let's see, or a daughter named, shoot, I can't even find her. Her name is Margaret Tudor. She actually marries the King of Scotland later down the line, which eventually will lead to that Scotland getting involved in the English monarchy in 1489. But in 1491, Henry VII has a son that takes precedence over her, and this is the very famous Henry VIII, who will become Henry VIII. Now, Henry VIII actually had an older brother named Arthur. We'll find out what happens to Arthur later down the line. But that's in 1491 when Henry VIII is born. Henry VII continues to rule for quite a little bit. Now we get to 1500. 1502, shortly after marrying Catalina de Aragon, this guy here, Arthur, dies. He dies in 1502. He's pretty young. He's like 15 or something, 16. I don't even know how old he is. He's pretty young. Yeah, he's 16. He dies, leaving now Henry VIII is now the number one in line, and he's got no other brothers, so Margaret is now second in line. So now was never expected. Arthur was definitely expected to become king, but he died of some disease that was really shocking to England. He was the Prince of Wales and everything. They hyped him up, and then Henry VIII comes in. So then he remarries his wife. So 1500s go by. 1509, Henry VII passes away, leaving Henry VIII now king in 1510. So Henry VIII is now on the throne. His sisters are Margaret Tudor and Mary Tudor. Margaret and Mary Tudor, they are now the monarchs. Now, Henry VIII, before he died, he said the will would go after his kids would go through Mary's line here, so it wouldn't interfere with Scotland. His younger sister, Mary, not Margaret. But those rules were not followed in his will, and then Margaret's line ended up getting inherited later. But this is only 1510. That's way down the line. In 1512, Margaret has a son named James. Now, James is actually the King of Scotland. This is King James V of Scotland. Right now, he was the second heir to Henry VIII, but Henry VIII does end up having his own child, Mary, right here, in 1516. So that jumps Margaret down to now a second line. So it's going to be, we got 1520s now. Henry VIII starting his schemes, his divorces and stuff, and his beheadings starting to go on now. And in 1533, he has his second daughter, Elizabeth. Elizabeth is now his daughter. She is now in line for the throne in 1533. That happens until 1537, when Henry VIII has a son named Edward VI. Now he passes up Elizabeth, and now Mary is now down to 1537 in the there. But Henry VIII, none of his kids actually had kids. He had 3 kids in total, 6 wives, of course. None of them actually ended up having kids. So Henry VIII has no grandkids to this day, or any descendants for that matter. Sad truth of it, but that's how it is. So 1530s go by, 1540s. Henry VIII is still kicking, ages, but in 1547, Henry VIII dies. Oh yeah, he gets in like a wrestling match with Francois in like 1521 or something. That's pretty cool. But in 1547, he dies. His health really decreases. He's got like a really bad stench in his leg. It smelled horrible or something. And then he gets really unhealthy and eventually dies in 1547, leaving his beloved son, Edward VI. That's why he kept divorcing and beheading some wives, because he just wanted a son heir. Kind of scheming past this a little bit, but this is pretty important. Edward VI becomes the king in 1547. So these are actually his half-sisters that he had with different wives, Anne Boleyn and stuff. This is Mary and Elizabeth. So Edward VI is now the king. So now there's a problem, because the Reformation had happened in the 1510s. There was something known as the English Reformation. If you've ever heard of the Lutheran Church, Protestants, Catholics. England had always been Catholic monarchy until Henry VII had come around. Henry VII changed it to Protestantism. Well, no, it wasn't Henry VII. It was Henry VIII that did that. Henry VIII changed it to Protestant monarchy because he hated the Pope, to be honest. That's the best way to put it. Opposed Martin Luther. Well, actually, no, he supported Martin Luther, the reformer. Did not like the Pope at all, so he divorced Catherine of Aragon, all that stuff. Then Edward VI becomes king. Now, he does not want the throne to go, because next in line, technically, is Mary. She's Catholic. He does not want a Catholic monarch. So he actually is about to die. He gets leukemia. No. Is it leukemia? I don't know what he gets. Some sort of disease. I don't remember what it was. I think it was leukemia, but I could be wrong. In 1553. So, he makes his heir, he changes his heir plans in 1553 to bypass his sister's Mary, because if he's going to bypass Mary, bypass Elizabeth as well. So now he's in favor of his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, who is now the most senior Catholic heir, or Protestant heir, because the other ones are Catholic, even the Scottish monarch. So that bypassed Margaret's line. So he actually listened to Henry VIII, his father's will. So now his heir was now his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, and then her sister, Catherine Grey. Right there are now his heirs, but he dies at the age of 15. Lady Jane Grey becomes queen for about 9 days before somebody gets mad again. Mary comes in and ruins the party. So now we're back in a Catholic monarchy. She tried to revert England back to Catholicism, and in the process burned a lot of people at the stake. She's known as Bloody Mary, Mary the First there, Queen Mary the First. But she didn't care much about the succession. She actually married the King of Spain. Imagine if they would have had kids. The Queen of England and the King of Spain had children. That'd be crazy. But for now, her heir is still Elizabeth right now, which is her half-sister. She's Protestant, though, which is very crazy. Now, I'm not sure. And then her second heir is Mary, Queen of Scots. She's now the Queen of Scotland. She had become Queen of Scotland. She was like 6 days old or something crazy like that. Queen of Scotland. Mary, Queen of Scots. Pretty famous. She was, at this point, maybe married to Francois II of France, I think. But I don't know for sure at this point. She goes on and does a very bloody reign until 1559, when Elizabeth comes in now. Elizabeth has no kids. She's known as the Virgin Queen. She never married or anything. And then I heard that she didn't want, I don't know. Like, she had, like, really disgusting teeth or something. Like, she was, like, I don't even know, Elizabeth. But she was a great queen. Her heir now is Mary, Queen of Scots. And Elizabeth does not like Mary, Queen of Scots, because she's Catholic. And Elizabeth, her reign was known as the Elizabethan age, because Shakespeare was performing a lot of his plays during that time. Or, not, that wasn't because it was Elizabeth, but he was performing his plays at the time. Catherine Grey is now in line, because Mary, Queen of Scots doesn't have any kids. And this is just Mary Tudor, previously Mary Tudor, if we go back to here, about the 1510s. This is her. That's her daughter, Catherine Grey. Oh, I'm going back way too far. Oh, man, where am I at? Okay. Okay. Where are we at? We're in the 1560s. Okay. So that's Catherine Grey. She's right there. Lady Jane Grey was executed, by the way, if I didn't already mention that. So now stuff happens in the 1560s. In 1566, Mary Queen of Scots has a son named James. James is actually Protestant, which Elizabeth likes. But she knows that since Elizabeth doesn't have any kids and there's no line, Elizabeth's kind of scared that she's going to get killed by Mary Queen of Scots, and Mary Queen of Scots kind of wants to take the English throne. It's pretty much inevitable at this point is that the Scottish monarchs are going to take the throne of England. It's pretty much inevitable at this point. Unless we go through Catherine Grey. She's our only hope, but that's not going to happen. So Mary Queen of Scots has a son, James, in 1566. But in 1567, Elizabeth's like, you know what? I'm done with Mary Queen of Scots. I'm having her executed. So she sends in people to go into Scotland, capture Mary Queen of Scots, imprison her in London, kill her. So now she's dead by 1567. Now her son, James, who's like really young, obviously he doesn't know much. So Elizabeth's not scared of him at all. She's like, hey, whatever. I just want a peaceful rest of my life. Thank you, Mary. And then Catherine Grey is still back on in the 1560s. In 1569, Catherine Grey has a son. Or no, that's not Catherine Grey. Catherine Grey dies in 1568. So in 1569, let me see what happens. No, that's not what happens. Catherine Grey has a, is that her son? Who is that? She dies in 1568. Trying to figure out who this person is here. Oh, yeah, she does have a son. Catherine Grey dies, but her son is a person named Sir Edward Seymour, the Lord Beauchamp. He is now the heir to this line here in 1569. So now we go through 1570s. Now she's dealing with Spanish Armada once we get to the 1580s. Until we get, that was in 1588. Elizabeth's got a very long reign, too. All right, in 1590, we made it all the way to 1593. In 1593, I think 1594, James the First has a son. Or James, he's not James the First yet. But he has a son right now. Trying to get back on here real quick. Hold on. Oh yeah, Francis Brandon, Mary Tudor has a son. Sorry, I didn't talk about that, but I should have. This video is very long, so just want to get that out of the way. Trying to get around here. Margaret, James the Fourth, James the Fifth, James Stewart, Mary Stuart. Oh, there's Stuarts, by the way. James the First doesn't have any, or he is one. Okay, this is Henry Frederick Stuart right here. He was born in 1594 and is the heir to James right here, who's the heir to Elizabeth. That happens until 15. Now we're into 1600. Elizabeth's almost done, and she dies in 1603. Now putting James, the King of Scotland, on the throne in 1604. He's now on the throne. Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in the Americas, was named after James I. He also authorized the King James Bible in 1611. 1611. So now he's the king. All right, so that's his son Henry Frederick is the Prince of Wales, and then there is his second son Charles, which I didn't talk about him. He was like really young at this point. So those are his two eldest sons. He writes the King James Bible in 1611, which a lot of people, it's one of the main ones used. Yeah. That's 1611. So we're going to move on in 1613. I think, he dies in 1612. His eldest son, Henry, dies in 1612. So now his second son, Charles, now becomes the heir by 1613. He doesn't have any more sons, so James the First, his eldest daughter, who her name is, I think, is Elizabeth. I don't really know. What is her name? Is it Margaret? It's Margaret. No, it's Elizabeth. Elizabeth Stuart, born in 1596. So we're now at 1613. She's now the second heir behind Charles, her brother. Stuff happens in 1610, 1620, Thanksgiving, starting to colonize the United States now, North America right now. 1625, James the First dies. He actually reigns really long because he'd been on the throne of Scotland since the 1560s, and he leaves in 1625. And now in 1626, Charles, his son, his eldest son, is now on the throne. He is King Charles the First. James the First, and then I'm going to get to Charles the First. Charles the First, his heir is still his sister Elizabeth, and then she has a son named Karl the First von Pfaff, and that's him right there. Charles the First he has a son in 1630 named Charles. He names him Charles. After him, he'll eventually become Charles II in 1630, and then the next in line is still his sister Elizabeth Stuart. In 1631, he has a daughter, Charlotte. No, not Charlotte. Mary Henrietta. And then in 1633, she's bypassed by James, second son. It's always good for monarchs to have two sons, just in case something happens to the first son, which, as you see, actually happens quite a bit. But by 1633, Charles has a sustained monarchy right now with his, remember, they're all Protestant right now. They do not want to be Catholic. With Charles II and James II as his heirs. 1630s happen. Now we're into the 1640s. Now, in 1649 is when they start the English Civil War, and Charles I famously gets beheaded by a man named Oliver Cromwell's army. And this is known as the Commonwealth period in England and Scotland. England and Scotland are united by now. But that's in 1649 when the Civil War starts, and Charles I king gets beheaded. So now in 1650, there is now the Commonwealth. This is the English Commonwealth during the English Civil War right now. It's happening in the 1650s because Oliver Cromwell actually rules. He's king in everything but name, essentially. So, but in 1660, Charles, his son, Charles I's son, takes the throne back. Becomes Charles II in 1660. His heir is obviously his brother James II, and then his this guy over here, I believe, is his other brother. Charles I had another son named Henry Stuart, but he died in 1660. So in 1661, it's going to change again. This guy is William. William is now the heir to Charles II, or actually after James II. He is the son. Let me see. Who is he? He's the son of Mary back here. Mary. She was born in 1631. Her son, but she's dead by 1660. 1649. We're done with Charles I, sadly. Rest in peace. All right. So now he becomes the heir in 1661, but that's only in 1661 because in 1662, James right here, Charles never had any kids. He had a lot of illegitimate kids, though. He had a lot of mistresses, but he did not actually have a wife. Or he did have a wife. He just didn't have any kids with the queen. So here is James II. James II or his younger brother James has a daughter named Mary. Now she's the heir now in 1662 when she's born. Okay. Now, where am I at? It's in 1662. But actually in 1663, James II has a son. So that bypasses Mary. His name was James Stuart. He's very young right now in 1663. So now he's second in line. In 1666, the Great Fire of London happens, and Charles II is very involved in cleaning up London after that. That was a horrible event that happened. In 1667, though, James II's son, Henry, dies, so by 1668, Mary's back in the second in line of succession, because now we know that females are definitely going to be inheriting the throne. Now, it's now officially male preference primogeniture, if we didn't already establish that. It's now in 1669. 1670s just happens by 1685. Charles II dies without any kids, leaving his son James, or his brother James. James was his brother. James II, his brother, as the king now. He's got 2 daughters in total. He doesn't have any sons because his other son died. Mary, and then he has his second son, Anne. Right there. They're pretty familiar. So that happens. So we get 1687, 1688. In 1688, around 1687, King James II converts to Catholicism, which was a no-no in England at this time because they had a Protestant monarchy. And a lot of people liked it that way. So it wasn't really too much of a problem because James II didn't seem like he was going to have any more kids, and they know when James II dies that the throne's just going to pass through his daughter Mary, who's Protestant. Mary and Anne are Protestant, so the Protestant monarchy should continue. But he married a second wife who was Catholic, James II. So by 1688, he married her and had a son with the Catholic wife. So this guy here, James, who's known as the Old Pretender, becomes the heir. He is Catholic, of course, and a lot of people don't like that. So William and Mary is married to a man named William of Orange, who is actually like a Dutch. He's Dutch. She's from the Netherlands. They invite her to come in and overrule James. Well, James actually, first of all, he gets his son and he gets the heck out of there because he knows that he's gonna die if he doesn't do anything about it because they're gonna get rid of him. And then they pass a law. Parliament. This is known as the Glorious Revolution in 1689. So now Mary and Elizabeth, they come in, or not Mary and Elizabeth, Mary and William rule as Mary II and William III. They rule now. William III obviously going back all the way to William the Conqueror, stuff. But They are now in the Glorious Revolution in 1689. They passed the Bill of Rights, making English citizens actually have some say in things, not being bossed around by the monarchs how they previously had been since 1689. This is the Glorious Revolution, so James gets out of there. That does not mean that James's son, James II, lives until 1701, I think. 1701. By 1689, yeah, but the Old Pretender and his son Bonnie Prince Charlie, they're going to have several revolts known as Jacobites revolts that happened throughout the early 1700s, trying to take back the throne from the Protestants. So they officially make a law right now that bars Catholics from inheriting the throne. Now, no Catholic ever can inherit the throne, and nobody who is a descendant of a Catholic can inherit the throne, I think, unless they're Protestant, which is pretty rare. Usually, what your parents are religiously. Now we're in the 1690s. Mary II. I'm not showing any heirs right now because they're joint reign, but Mary II dies in 1694, making William now the heir. But William, it doesn't pass through his kids or anything because it's now going to go through Mary's younger sister, Anne, is now back in line as of 1695. She's now in line, now going to be the heir of William III when he dies. And Anne has a son named William, the Duke of Gloucester, right now. But he does not live long. He dies at like 11 years old or something, so 1696. He dies in 1700. He dies, leaving now. The heir is now a very distant relative, Sophia of Hanover. She's German, actually. She is a descendant. She's the only descendant of Elizabeth Stuart. Elizabeth Stuart is the daughter of freaking Mary. No, James the First. No, yeah, James the First. Way back here, about 100 years before. He was the guy who wrote the Bible, James' Bible. And then she had a granddaughter, Sophia. She's born in the 1630s, so she's pretty old by this point. And so that's how it goes to the kings of Hanover. Hanover was its own separate kingdom, and then Germany was split into several different kingdoms back in this period. So now she's now second in line in 1701, and Queen Anne has like 17 kids, and none of them survive. All of them die in infancy, except for William, but then he dies. Sadly, a sad story with Queen Anne. Really, really sad story with Queen Anne. And that's Sophia. She's queen. She's not queen. She's heir now in 1701. But in 1702, William III dies. Now Queen Anne is now the queen. So in 1703, you can literally see the sun is setting behind me. I've been filming for a long time now. It's 7:20. Oh my god. But yeah, Sophia is now the heir apparent to Queen Anne as of now in 1703. And then her son is George, known as Georg. They speak no English at all. They're German, essentially. So that's George. He will become George the First later down the line. He's now second in line in 1703. Queen Anne continues to rule until she dies in 1714. In 1714, actually, Sophia barely misses out on becoming queen. She dies in 1714, just a few months before Queen Anne does. They both die in 1714. So now in 1715, George is now the king. He comes in with like 7 mistresses and cooks coming in, riding into England. He doesn't speak a word of English. He barely even spends any time in England during his reign. He's the king of England, doesn't even speak English, which a lot of people are like, this doesn't make any sense. Why is this guy? So then they invent the prime minister, Robert Walpole, in 1721. So that's when that happens, but that's later down the line. So his heir, he has a son right now named George. He's later going to become George II. I freaking love George II. Look at this guy's hair. Oh my God, one of my favorite monarchs. Look at that guy's hair. It is just glorious. Absolutely glorious. And then George II, oh crap. He's got a son named Frederick, who's the Prince of Wales. Not yet. He's not the Prince of Wales yet. This guy's the Prince of Wales right now. These two they all speak German, essentially. I think this guy was born in 1707. I'm going 1717, 1720s. This is where the Prime Minister comes in 1721. So now we're in the House of Hanover, completely in the House of Hanover. So the monarchy has changed hands to a completely different house. Now we get to the 1720s. In 1727, George I dies. Now his son, George II, is now king. And so his heir now is now the Prince of Wales, Frederick. And then the second heir is George II's second son, a man by the name of George II. He's born in 1683 and died in 1760. He's a man by the name. Okay, we're way back here. We're in 1720s, 1729. It's good. He is a guy named. This is the year George II was born. Wow, back here. We'll go to 1729. Okay, that's where we were at earlier. Sorry about that. Anyway, his name was. That's not his son, is it? No, it's his brother. A guy named Prince William Augustus. William Augustus is the second heir of George II. He's George II's second son. Now we're in 1730, 1731, 1732. We're getting on in here. In 1737, Frederick has a daughter. His eldest child, Frederick, has a daughter named Augusta Charlotte Hanover. And then in 1738, he has a son named George, who takes precedence over her. George is now the heir. Now he will become King George III. He is a very famous king. George III was famously king during the American Revolution. He was born back in 1738, the original guy. He is the grandson. A lot of people think he's the son of George II. People forget about Frederick, but no, he was the grandson of George II. George III was. But Frederick ends up dying. You'll see why. 1739, 1740s go by. 49, there's a peasant. The Jacobite George II fights him off. Good word. So in 1751, Frederick dies. In 1751. Let me get a little stretch in. Oh my gosh, yes, this feels so good to lay back. Holy crap. Man, this feels good to lay back. I've been. See some of this stuff. Ah, yes. So Frederick dies in 1751. Leaving now his heir is now George III, is now George II's heir. And then George II's another grandson. This guy here is also the son of Frederick, Prince of Wales, of course. George II has a younger brother. That's this guy here. His name is Edward Augustus. George II reigns until his death. He dies in 1760. He's on the toilet when he dies. He goes in to get hot chocolate, and then his heart explodes on the toilet, which is pretty suspicious. I don't really know what happened to George II there. But yeah, George III is his heir. So in 1761, George III is now on the throne, and then his brother, Edward Augustus, is now the heir. And then George III has another brother named William Henry, the Duke of Gloucester in Edinburgh. Edinburgh is Scotland, so that's in the 1760s. George III, though, he doesn't last very long because in 1762, George III has a son of his own named George. He's now the Prince of Wales. So now Augustus over here is now second in line. In 1763, George III has another son named... George III has a lot of sons. His name is good old freaking Frederick Augustus Hanover. I don't know where all this Augusta things are coming from, but that's in 1763 as him. 1764, 1765 is by. Now we're into the 1770s. This is when he's fighting the American Revolution. George III is king, and he fights against them. 1776. Those guys. 1780s. By 1796, George IV, who's George III's son, is still Prince of Wales right now, has a daughter named Princess Charlotte. Princess Charlotte is now the third heir, because it's George III's granddaughter, Charlotte. George III stays on the throne for a long time after the American Revolution. So now she's in there. So now we're up into 1800. George III's on the throne for a very long time, if you can't tell right now. He's been king forever. Seems like 1810 goes by. He's finally starting to pass up Henry III now. He's now the longest reigning monarch in British history. George III has now just become. In 1817, though, something happened that interrupted the whole thing. Charlotte dies in 1817 without any kids. She's actually giving birth. She dies in childbirth. And then now Frederick Augustus is now back in the line in 1818. After George, of course. And then in 1820, George III finally dies at the age of like 80-something after a 60-year reign. This man had been on the throne since 1760. Look at that. Look how long he'd been on the throne for. It's a long freaking time he'd been king. So he finally dies, and once we get to 1821, George IV is now on the throne. George IV now has no sons. And guess what? Frederick doesn't have any sons either. So it goes to the next in line would be the third son of George III. His name is William. William doesn't have any kids either. And there was a huge problem with that. So now we get to 1822. In 1827, this guy dies. So now William IV is now in the line of succession by 1828. 1828, he doesn't have any sons, and the fourth son of George III is dead. But he has one daughter named Victoria. She's about 9 years old at this time, and she is now the third in line after William. She is this really weird situation with this stuff. George IV dies in 1830, leaving the throne to William. He becomes King William IV, and then next in line is actually the fifth son of George III. He inherits the titles of Hanover because Victoria can't because she's female. Now, this is Victoria's uncle right here, the fifth son of George III. Actually, yeah, George III's son. This guy here is son. So, wow. George III's son. Fifth son. And he's on there. So now we're in 1832. That happens until 1837. In 1837, William IV dies. Victoria becomes queen in 1838. Or actually 1837 when she actually becomes queen. She's the daughter of the Duke of Kent, by the way, who is the son of George III. Where are we at here? This is Ernest Augustus Hanover, right there, that man, who is now second in line. Go on over there. He's now first in line of the throne after Victoria in 1838. He has a son. I think this is probably his son, Ernest Augustus. He was born in 1771. His son is a guy named George Frederick von Hanover, born in 1819. He's the same age as Queen Victoria. That happens. But in 1840, Victoria has a daughter, names her Victoria. She ends up marrying. So complicated. This is why she's like the ancestor of so many. Every single monarch today descends from Victoria. She was born in 1840. Augustus. Her son. This is Victoria. She actually ended up marrying Friedrich and was the mother of Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany during World War I, who was, Kaiser during that. Like way later down the line. She's the mother of this is 1840. 1841, she has a son. Oh, that bumps Ernest Augustus down to second place. And then in 1841, she has a son named Edward VII. He becomes Edward VII later down the line. Then Victoria, her daughter's now second in line. Until we get to 1844. In 1844, Victoria has another son by the name of... What was his name? His name was Alfred of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. These people were part of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Victoria herself was a Hanover queen. These guys are part of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. She married Prince Albert. This goes on. She reigns for a very long time, too. 1850s. People are living longer. The world's changing right now during her reign very fast. And by the time we get to 1864, Edward VII, her son has a son named Albert Victor. This is Victoria's grandson now. He's in line. Throne. Now we get through the rest of the 1860s, 1870s. Something's going to happen to this guy right down the line. Through the 1870s, stuff is going down. Victoria's getting old. The world is changing very fast. Monarchs are dying. She's barely kicking with the British monarchy, making it through to the end of the 19th century. She's made it to 1900. If you see, not much happened at this point. But in 1892, I forgot to mention, in 1892, Albert Victor dies, and then Edward VII's second son, George, is now in line to the throne. He eventually becomes George V. So now we get to 1900. In 1901, Victoria finally dies after a very long time of being there. And then in 1902, the throne passes to Edward VII. He's been waiting for a long time to become king. And then there's George V, and then his son, Edward. Now they're part of the House of Windsor. Actually, this is still Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. They don't change it until World War I. Edward VII reigns until 1910, since he was so old by the time he didn't live very long. So once we get to 11, George V, and his son Edward. Edward doesn't have any kids yet, or actually never did. He doesn't have any kids, so then it's going to kids yet, and then it's going to George VI is now second in line, the second son of George V. So now World War I happens starts in 1914 here with George V. He changes the royal house name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor, because he doesn't want a German-sounding name, because they were fighting against Germany in World War I. So those guys. In 1926 is when the current queen, Queen Elizabeth II, was born. This is her father right there. We're going in 1929, 1930s. 1936 is when George V dies, and then his son Edward becomes King Edward VIII for about 11 months, and then he abdicates to marry a twice-divorced American woman, which was very controversial. So he had two choices. He's like, I can either abdicate and marry her, or I can stay on the throne and not marry her. So he chose to do the first. So he could either stay on the throne and not marry her, or marry her and abdicate, and he chose the latter, which is, I don't know why he did that, but he did. So in 1937, actually, when he becomes king, George VI, his brother, has a daughter named Elizabeth, who is now the heir to the throne. 1937, George VI is on the throne. Elizabeth, right here, says, what are you doing? Elizabeth is now the heir to the throne in 1937. Then she has a younger sister named Margaret, who is the second in line after her. George VI had 2 daughters in total. Stays the same. So George VI dies, and Queen Elizabeth, or she's not queen yet. Princess Elizabeth has a son in 1948, Charles, who's still alive. All these people are still alive. This is how incredibly old the British monarchy is. He's Prince Charles. He's now the Prince of Wales. He was actually third in line at this point after George VI and Queen Elizabeth II. 1949, 1950. George VI dies in 1952, February of 1952, and then Elizabeth becomes queen. She has a daughter at this point named Princess Anne, she's still alive too. She is now the heir after Charles, until Elizabeth has a son in 1960, named Andrew, who bypasses her. So now Charles and Andrew are still alive. Her heirs by 1960. Not much is going to happen since then, because Elizabeth just stays on the throne forever. One of the longest reigning monarchs in human history, Elizabeth II is. Remember, she took the throne back here. He was all the way through. There's Andrew. Then nothing happens until Charles has a child in 1982. He has a son named Prince William. He is now the Duke of Cambridge, and he is now second in line to the throne. And everything in the past 40 years has stayed the exact same as for succession goes. So we get the 1990s, 2000s, 2010s, and 2020s, all the way to 2022. And she's still on the throne, and Charles is still the #1 heir, and William is the #2. Charles' son. So that is the entire history of the British monarchy from William the Conqueror to Elizabeth II, 1066 to 2022. Let's take a quick relook at the whole thing and go backwards. I'll go somewhat slow. We're just going to go back every single year now. See how it unfolded. Actually, I'll just go faster. Go. Bam, bam, bam. Get all the way back here now. Get all the way back here. 1400s, 1300s, 1200s. Get back to 1066. There we go. So that's the entire history of the British monarchy. Every single king's heir since 1066 all the way to 2022. And we're going to go forward again just because it's just cool seeing it all happen. Look at some of these guys. That was a long video. I'm really sorry about that. Wow, that was a long video. I don't know how long that was. You know, that's about 1,000 years of English history we just went over there. Wow, so there you go. All right, so I guess with that, I'll thank you guys for watching, and be sure to comment, like, subscribe. So about all I got for today. Let me know what if I missed anything, I got anything wrong, if there was an error that I forgot about. Sorry I included like one illegitimate son. I didn't mean to do that back in the early times of the British monarchy. If you want to see me do this with other monarchs, like the French monarchs, I would love to do that. That one would be really interesting because of the male-only rule. Maybe we could look over who would be the King of France today if that would happen. So, with that, I want to thank you guys for watching. Be sure to comment, like, subscribe. And I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye. Wah! Love of my life right there, Queen Elizabeth.